Hey guys, tonight we're heading north, far north, where the salty air cuts through the fjords, where smoke curls from turf-roofed homes, and where the women of the Viking world watch the horizon with a mix of power and pressure. Imagine yourself standing in a longhouse lit by the flicker of a hearth fire. Shadows leap against carved beams, the scent of smoked fish and wool grease clings to the air, and a woman with steel-gray eyes quietly commands the rhythm of the room. She stirs the pot, issues orders to thralls, counts the stored barley, and keeps the keys to every locked chest. This is her kingdom, but don't get too comfortable. You probably won't survive this winter storm or the next raid unless you learn fast how women here hold sway and where their limits begin. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love for you to drop your location and your local time in the comments. It's always fun to see where in the world we're all curling up together for these late-night stories. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The firelight dances as you take your seat on the longhouse bench. Viking women, at first glance, look like background figures, tending to stew and children while men sharpen blades and boast of voyages. But stay a little longer, and you realize how much hinges on their choices. The hearth isn't just for warmth, it's the beating heart of the household economy. The woman who tends it is a quiet general, directing resources that could make or break the family's survival. Historians remind us that in sagas and law codes, the woman of the house isn't invisible at all. She's the one who holds the keys. Literally. Keys dangle from belts, clinking against woven wool skirts. They unlock storerooms of food, chests of silver, and sometimes hidden weapons. The quirky part: archaeologists have found graves where women are buried with their keys, a final declaration of their role as keepers of life's essentials. It's like being the family's chief operating officer, except your office smells perpetually of herring and smoke. And while a man might swagger about on a ship, he knows full well that if his wife or mother mismanages supplies, he could return to an empty home or starving kin. Still, historians argue whether this authority should really be called power. After all, the home domain was one of the only arenas left open to women. Outside it, their voice grew faint in the noise of councils and raids. Picture it. You have the ability to tell a thrall when to chop wood, but you cannot decide whether your son sails to England or stays. That tension, visible power, invisible walls, defines much of the Viking woman's life. You shuffle closer to the hearth, the heat sinking into your bones. Imagine the work: hauling water from icy streams, patching sails, spinning wool until your fingers ache, then trading yarn for fish with the neighbor. You think of all the medieval housewives stereotypes, but here the labor is brutal and every mistake could kill. Miscalculate food stores, the family starves. Fail to mend sails, the voyage never returns. Historians still argue whether Viking women carried this weight willingly, embracing their responsibilities, or whether they silently cursed the chains hidden beneath their keyrings. And yet there's admiration too. Foreign chroniclers peering into the north often noted how Viking women seemed oddly free. Compared to Christian women further south, they weren't locked away. They walked through markets, they joined in feasts, they had visible places in the rhythms of daily life. Some were feared for their sharp tongues. Imagine being roasted alive in verse by your neighbor across the table, because Viking women were notorious for publicly insulting men if provoked. It's not exactly what you expect in a smoky timber hall, but there it is. Here's a quirky little tidbit. In Icelandic sagas, women sometimes egged men into battle by calling them cowards if they hesitated. Imagine sipping mead when your wife leans across the bench and says, "Oh, so you're just going to sit here, weaving like the women." That's the medieval equivalent of being roasted on social media. And it worked, sometimes too well. Feuds erupted because of words spoken in the firelight, words wielded by women who otherwise had little recourse in the male arena. As you lean back, the smoke curling up toward the rafters, you realize how complex the scene is. Viking women weren't simple homemakers. They were guardians, provocateurs, memory keepers, and survival strategists. They commanded the fires of their fjords, but the limits were always there, like the wooden walls of the longhouse keeping them penned in. Tomorrow, you'll follow them out into the cold marriage markets, where silver and alliances matter more than affection. But for now, you're left with the warmth of the fire, the clink of keys, and the quiet authority of women both feared and oppressed. The longhouse smoke still clings to your hair as you step outside, but the air here tastes of salt and iron. Down at the village's edge, where boats scrape against pebbled shores, you see something less cozy than the hearth: the tense negotiations of marriage. Forget romance. This is the Viking world, and partnerships are transactions wrapped in survival. You watch as families gather in clusters, cloaks pulled tight, their voices low but sharp. The clink of silver, the gleam of amber beads, the nods of approval, all of it feels like a market, except the goods are people. For a Viking woman, marriage isn't about falling in love by moonlight. It's about securing alliances, strengthening bloodlines, and ensuring that property stays inside the right kin group. Daughters are bargaining chips in the grand chess game of clan survival. Historians still argue whether women had meaningful say in this process, or whether the final choice was always a father's to make. Some sagas hint that women could refuse outright, while others show them dragged into unions like unwilling pawns. And that's the cruel paradox. You might be the heart of the home, but you rarely choose whose hearth you'll tend. You edge closer to the crowd. A man in a fur-trimmed cloak counts silver coins with the seriousness of a priest measuring out holy bread. Another family lays out woven cloth, imported glass beads, and most symbolically, keys. Dowries weren't just about wealth. They symbolized the authority a woman carried with her into marriage. If she arrived with keys to her father's storeroom, she was expected to wield new ones in her husband's hall. A quirky archaeological detail. Graves sometimes contain not just keys, but weighing scales. Tiny reminders that Viking women were both keepers of households and literal balancers of wealth. But don't mistake this ritual for a cold ledger. There's tension here. Imagine you're the bride, standing silently as your value is debated in silver and cattle. Every coin dropped on the table is a measure of your body, your womb, your worth. Some women, especially those from powerful families, leverage this position to gain surprising influence. Marry into the right alliance, and suddenly your voice echoes in decisions of raids and land division. Marry poorly, and you vanish into the shadows of an unfamiliar hall. It's not all bleak, though, at least compared to some medieval societies further south. In Viking culture, a woman could retain ownership of her dowry. If the marriage soured, she might even take it back. That's a shocker to many modern ears. Medieval Christian Europe often stripped women of property upon marriage, but here in the north, at least a sliver of independence remained. It's a small ember in a cold landscape, but it matters. Picture one of those feasts again. Men clashing goblets, boasting of raids, women weaving and whispering. In the corner, a wife and husband lock eyes, not with tenderness but with calculation. Each knows what the other brought to the marriage table. Each knows what's at stake if one falters. It's not Shakespearean romance. It's a contract of survival. And survival had its grim price tags. Some unions stretched across seas, brides taken from raids, captives forced into Viking households. Here, where oppression sharpens into something darker, not every woman at the marriage market came willingly. Some were foreign slaves, dragged into new lives where their labor and bodies were currency. Historians still debate the scale of this practice, but the sagas don't hide it. Sometimes the line between wife and concubine was a thin, shifting shadow. You can't help but wonder, what did it feel like to stand there, your future sealed with a handshake and a handful of silver? Did women daydream of escape? Did they scheme in silence, waiting for a better opportunity? The sagas give you glimpses: a fiery daughter who refuses one suitor, a sharp-tongued wife who manipulates her husband into acting, a widow who reclaims her fortune and walks away. These are the cracks in the stone wall, moments where the women of the North pushed back, even if only slightly. And there's another curious twist. Some sagas describe women orchestrating marriages themselves, arranging unions for their children or kin, ensuring alliances stayed strong. If you were a wealthy widow, especially, you might suddenly wield enormous influence. It's like inheriting the chessboard after a husband's death. Still, for every tale of a powerful widow, there are countless silent stories of daughters traded like cargo. That's the uneasy balance of Viking society: respect in one breath, repression in the next. The negotiation you've been watching ends with a clatter of hands meeting, silver being scooped into pouches, and the bride walking away with her new kin. She doesn't look back. The crowd disperses, voices fatting into the cold air. You stand there, realizing the truth. Viking women were valued, but they were also priced. Feared for their tongues, needed for their wombs, sometimes honored for their management, but always tethered to the bargaining table. Tomorrow, you'll step inside again, listening for the clink of keys at a woman's waist. The next chapter in this push and pull between household power and societal restraint. The silver from the marriage bargain still gleams in your imagination as you walk back toward the longhouse. But before you even enter, your ears catch a sound more telling than clinking coins: the steady jangle of iron keys against wool skirts. A Viking woman passes you, shoulders squared, keys hanging from her belt like a soldier's sword. These aren't just metal bits. They are the symbol of her authority, the right to open storerooms, access wealth, and guard the literal survival of the family. Inside, the air is thick with smoke and voices. You see her stride across the hall, thralls parting in her wake. She stops before a locked chest, kneels, and selects a key. The lid creaks open, revealing stacked silver rings, bolts of cloth, maybe even a jar of imported spices. Around her, men might laugh louder and boast bigger, but every eye darts to her when she works that lock. Power is not always loud. Sometimes it's the soft metallic click of a key turning. Historians love to point out that the mistress of the household, called a husfrige, was more than just a glorified housekeeper. She organized labor, rationed food, and oversaw the farmstead's rhythm. It's like being both mayor and accountant, except your city is a drafty wooden hall, and your citizens include restless children, cranky thralls, and occasionally half-frozen warriors. Quirky detail. Some sagas even describe women using their keys as makeshift weapons, swinging them like brass knuckles in tavern brawls. It's a pretty epic mental image. A furious Viking matron clocking some unlucky man with a keyring the size of a fistful of padlocks. Yet as much as keys symbolized authority, they also whispered confinement. The woman could unlock storerooms, but not the decisions of councils. She could command servants, but not dictate voyages. Historians still argue whether the key represented genuine independence or a gilded cage. Was the husfrige respected as a partner, or tolerated as a necessary manager of domestic chaos, while men handled the real business of war and politics? You lean against the wall, watching her distribute food. Her hands measure out dried fish with the precision of a modern accountant balancing a budget app. Each portion reflects her judgment, and in a land where winter can stretch into starvation, her math is life or death. A miscalculation here is as dangerous as a sword cut abroad. Suddenly, her role feels less like women's work and more like high-stakes resource management. And the home wasn't just food and fire. It was the social hub. Feasts, funerals, and weddings all revolved around the household space. Guess who orchestrated those events? Yep, the woman with the keys. Imagine the logistics: brewing enough mead for 30, roasting whole animals, arranging seating so feuding families don't kill each other before dessert. It's like hosting Thanksgiving every week, except with more axes on the table. Of course, the sagas didn't always flatter these women. They're sometimes cast as nagging wives, quick to stir feuds with sharp tongues. But read between the lines and you see the truth. Their words carried weight. If a wife publicly insulted a man's honor during a feast, she could light the fuse of a blood feud. That wasn't trivial, it was political dynamite. Her voice could shape the fate of families, even if it came wrapped in sarcasm rather than decrees. Here's something fringe but fascinating. Some scholars think the key's symbolism might also connect to fertility. Keys open locked spaces, after all, and in a culture where children were lifelines, it's possible that keys hanging at the waist weren't just about storerooms but about wombs. It's speculative. Historians still argue whether that interpretation is too poetic, but the imagery fits in a society where everything tied back to survival. Picture yourself lying on the bench in the hall, half dozing as the fire crackles. You hear the woman's keys rattle whenever she walks past, an audible reminder that in this world, survival is locked in chests, sealed in jars, and rationed out by the keeper of the house. You realize she holds power, yes, but always power framed by men's expectations. Her authority is granted, not self-declared. And so the paradox deepens. Viking women were respected enough to manage households, yet restricted from shaping the broader currents of society. Feared for their sharpness, trusted for their management, but always fenced within invisible lines. The keys jangle once more as she locks the chest and walks away. You close your eyes, wondering how many women dreamed of keys that opened doors beyond the longhouse walls, doors to ships, to councils, to uncharted freedoms. The fire's warmth fades as you step outside again, and this time the night air feels charged. Word spreads through the settlement. Someone claims to have seen a woman take up arms, fighting beside men on a raid. The whispers race like sparks along dry straw. Shield maiden. Your ears perk up. Could it be true? Did Viking women really march into battle, axes in hand, helmets catching the sun like their brothers? The sagas certainly suggest so. You've probably heard of Lagertha, the legendary shield maiden said to have fought with Ragnar Lothbrok. In those stories, she's ferocious, commanding warriors, slashing through enemies like a storm with braids. But here's the historian's hiccup. Sagas were written centuries later, during the Christian era, by men with plenty of reasons to exaggerate. Historians still argue whether shield maidens ever truly existed as a widespread phenomenon, or if they're literary symbols, part wish fulfillment, part folklore. Still, you crouch near the campfires tonight and hear young men muttering nervously about that woman who supposedly stood shoulder to shoulder with them in combat. Some swear it's true, others scoff and claim it's just a saga embellishment. What matters is not just whether it happened, but how the story persists. The idea of women warriors terrified and fascinated both allies and enemies. A woman holding a sword that rattled a very patriarchal imagination. Archaeologists occasionally fuel the fire. In 2017, a grave in Birka, Sweden, long assumed to belong to a male warrior because of its weapon-rich burial, was revealed through DNA testing to be female. Boom. Suddenly, everyone was talking. Was this proof of real shield maidens? Or was it an anomaly, perhaps a woman honored symbolically, or even a mistake in burial practices? The debate still simmers. One quirky angle. Some scholars point out that the skeleton had no obvious battle wounds, raising the possibility that she wasn't actually a fighter, but someone buried with weapons as ritual symbolism. Yet step into the world of the sagas, and the line between history and myth blurs deliciously. You can almost hear the chant of battle, the clash of iron, and see a woman in mail stride into the fray. Even if she's myth, she's powerful myth. So powerful that medieval clerics sometimes whispered warnings about northern women who fought like men. Foreign chroniclers painted Viking women as monstrous in their ferocity, perhaps exaggerating to stoke fear, perhaps reflecting kernels of truth. And there's irony here. While the image of the shield maiden has become iconic, poster material for shows and video games, in reality, most Viking women probably never touched a blade in battle. Their struggles were no less fierce, but they fought starvation, childbirth, and social constraints rather than Saxons. Still, don't you feel your pulse quicken at the thought of standing on a longship deck, shield in hand, salt spray hitting your face, and realizing that your enemy might underestimate you because you're a woman? It's the oldest psychological trick in the book. Fear thrives on the unexpected. Here's the quirky tidbit of the night. Some medieval laws in Scandinavia allowed women to man up, literally, by adopting male roles under special conditions. They could even inherit male legal rights in rare cases. Was this connected to the Shield Maiden legends? Historians still argue over whether such loopholes gave rise to these stories. Imagine being a widow with no sons. Suddenly, the law lets you step into roles otherwise reserved for men. It's not exactly strapping on armor, but it hints at a society where gender roles were bendy at the edges. Back at the settlement fire, one old skald begins to recite. His voice rises, describing a woman who leads men to war, her shield rimmed with blood. You notice how the children's eyes widen, the men nod uneasily, and the women, the women, half smile in the shadows. Whether or not shield maidens truly marched across the fields, their legend offers a kind of whispered rebellion. And maybe that's the point. Even if most Viking women never raised a sword, the very possibility echoed across sagas and firesides. It gave women a mythical space outside the kitchen, outside the hall, a place in the battle lines of imagination. You wonder if some young girl, listening to the skald's tale, secretly gripped a wooden spoon like a spear and dreamed of more. The fire dies down, leaving only embers. The story lingers in your mind. You know tomorrow you'll be back to listening about law, divorce, and how women sometimes pushed back through the courts instead of the battlefield. But for now, the phantom image of a woman with a round shield walking through the night stays with you, equal parts fear and freedom. The echoes of the skald's tale about shield maidens still hum in your ears as dawn seeps into the village. Smoke drifts lazily from the longhouses, and in that gray light you overhear a different kind of negotiation, not with silver or swords but with words wrapped in law. A man and woman stand before an elder, voices tight, and the subject isn't cattle or land this time. It's divorce. Yes, divorce, surprising, right? In Viking society, women had the legal right to dissolve a marriage under certain conditions. If the husband struck her, neglected her, or failed in his marital duties, she could walk away, sometimes literally. One saga describes a woman who stormed out of her hall, declaring in front of witnesses that she was divorced. She had to follow a formula, announcing it twice at home and once at the local assembly, the thing. The rules were strict, but the power was real. Imagine the drama of that moment. Slamming the metaphorical door on your husband in front of the entire community. But let's not romanticize it too much. Divorce was an option, yes, but it didn't magically erase the social chains. If you left your husband, you took your dowry with you, but you still needed a powerful family to back you. A poor woman without support. She risked being stranded, vulnerable, or pressured into remarriage. Historians still argue whether these rights were genuinely empowering or simply safeguards to keep households functioning smoothly. After all, a clan didn't want endless feuds erupting from miserable marriages. You watch as the elder mediates. He strokes his beard, considers the claims, and finally nods. The woman has spoken her formula, her kin stand behind her, and the husband looks sour but powerless. It feels almost modern, like a courtroom breakup, except the jury consists of neighbors leaning on spears. Here's a quirky tidbit. One saga recounts a wife divorcing her husband because he wore low-cut shirts that made him look too feminine. That's right, centuries before fashion police, Viking women were handing out marital red cards over wardrobe choices. It's both hilarious and telling. Honor, masculinity, and reputation were so central that a husband's clothing could end his marriage faster than infidelity might in another culture. Of course, not every attempt at divorce was so straightforward. The sagas also tell of women who tried to break free but were forced back or punished for overstepping. Legal rights don't always translate into lived freedom. You can almost hear the quiet murmurs of women weighing their options at night by the fire. Do I stay with him and keep the farm, or leave and risk disgrace? The power existed, but it was edged with danger. And the laws themselves, they varied across the Norse world. In Iceland, legal texts like the Graggas laid out detailed conditions for divorce, while in Norway, different assemblies enforced their own versions. The patchwork nature of these laws meant that a woman's ability to walk away depended heavily on where she lived and who was willing to support her. Historians still argue whether this legal wiggle room gave women more leverage in their marriages, or whether it mostly reinforced male dominance by keeping the rules of rebellion tightly controlled. You shuffle your feet on the frosty ground, watching the newly divorced woman walk away with her kin. Her head is high, but you can sense the undercurrent of risk. What will her life look like tomorrow? Will she remarry quickly, reclaiming stability? Or will she test the thin independence allowed her, keys jangling on her belt as she manages her own household for a time? It's a sharp contrast to the Shield Maiden stories you heard last night. On the battlefield, women's power is wrapped in myth and doubt. Here in the assembly, their power is written in law, precise and procedural. Both are limited, both are contested, and both show how Viking women balanced on a knife's edge, feared enough to wield social leverage, oppressed enough to need it in the first place. The crowd disperses, muttering about the next dispute. You hear someone joke about needing extra benches at the thing for all the feuding couples. Even in medieval Scandinavia, divorce gossip was a hot topic. You can't help but grin. Human drama, it seems, is timeless. As you turn back toward the longhouse, the jangle of keys echoes faintly again, and you realize those keys can lock doors or open them. The law gave Viking women a door to walk through, but whether that door led to freedom or just another cage, well, that's something historians are still arguing about. The frost has barely lifted from the grass when you find yourself following a group of women along a worn path leading out of the settlement. They aren't carrying baskets of fish or keys to storerooms this time. Instead, they hold carved staffs, pouches of herbs, and offerings wrapped in cloth. Their destination, a small grove, sacred long before the first cross ever cast its shadow here. This is the older world of the Vikings, the one where gods and spirits governed harvest, storms, and fates, and women often stood at the center of its rituals. You crouch near the trees, breath fogging as the group sets up a circle of stones. One woman raises her hands to the sky, her bracelets glinting in the morning light. She chants in a low rhythm, words older than the sagas, calling on Freyja or Frigg or perhaps a nameless local spirit. Historians point out that in pre-Christian Scandinavia, religious authority was not always a male monopoly. Women could serve as priestesses or ritual leaders, especially in rural communities. They were the ones who knew which herbs soothed pain, which chants warded storms, which offerings kept the gods appeased. Imagine being both healer and mystic, part scientist, part sorceress. But here, where it gets tricky, power in the spiritual realm was respected but also feared. A woman who guided rituals might be praised as wise, or accused of dabbling in something dangerous. Historians still argue whether these female religious roles reflected true authority, or if they were tolerated simply because men preferred not to get their hands dirty with certain rites. Either way, you feel the tension in the grove, admiration laced with suspicion. Quirky tidbit. Some accounts suggest Viking women used horse bones in fertility rites, burying them beneath doorways to attract prosperity. Archaeologists have dug up such remains, sparking debates about whether they were household blessings or leftovers from a feast. You can almost picture a woman giggling as she sneaks a horse skull under her neighbor's threshold, half spell, half prank. The women around you begin to sing, their voices weaving like threads through the trees. It's haunting, almost hypnotic, and you suddenly sense how fragile life feels in this world. When winter can starve you and storms can sink ships, you cling to anything that promises order. And often that promise comes through women, midwives, seers, priestesses, who shoulder the burden of hope. But danger lurks at the edge of the grove. Christianity is creeping northward, carried by missionaries and kings eager to unify power. Soon, these rituals will be branded pagan, even demonic. Women who once led chants at shrines will be silenced, their authority undercut by priests in robes. Historians still argue whether Christianity improved or worsened women's positions. It gave some new roles as saints and abbesses, but it also stripped them of old spiritual power. For now, though, the old ways still hold sway. The woman leading the chant steps forward and sprinkles mead on the ground, a libation for the unseen. The others bow their heads, murmuring prayers for healthy children, safe voyages, fertile fields. You feel the weight of their voices, a quiet chorus of survival sung in the shadow of gods who demand respect but rarely mercy. The ritual ends with laughter and shared bread. It's not all solemnity, it's community too. You realize that in a world where men often vanished on voyages for months or years, women's rituals anchored daily life. They were the ones who steadied the world while others chased plunder or glory. As the women file back toward the village, their staffs tapping against stones, you linger a moment longer. The grove feels heavy with presence, as if the gods themselves brushed past. You imagine how it must feel to be both revered and feared, respected for your wisdom yet watched closely for signs of too much power. That balance, admiration and suspicion, seems to echo through every corner of Viking women's lives. Tomorrow, you'll step into the halls of queens, concubines, and captives, where the stakes of power and oppression grow even sharper. But tonight, you leave the grove with the sound of women's voices still circling in your ears like wind through the pines, half prayer, half warning. The pine-scented air from the grove still lingers as you drift toward a much grander hall. Here, the smoke doesn't rise from a turf-roofed farmhouse but from carved beams adorned with dragon heads, a place where power feels heavier than mead and thicker than wool. This is the world of Viking elites, where women might wear crowns or shackles, depending on how fortune played its hand. Inside, the noise is overwhelming. Warriors slam cups on long tables, skalds chant verses, and the smell of roasted meat rolls through the air. But at the high seat beside a king or a jarl sits a queen. She's cloaked in rich furs, her jewelry gleaming in the firelight. Unlike the farm wife with her jangling keys, this woman commands attention with her very presence. Queens and noblewomen often acted as hostesses at feasts, distributing mead to warriors in ceremonial fashion. Sounds humble. It was. Passing the cup was a performance of power, a way of declaring, I control the flow of honor in this hall. Imagine the tension in each pour, spilled too much, and it could be read as insult, not accident. Historians remind us that some queens wielded serious influence. Take Queen Gunhild, wife of King Eric Bloodaxe, often remembered in the sagas as cunning, ruthless, and politically savvy. Was she really that fearsome, or was it saga writer slander? Historians still argue whether such portrayals reflect genuine power or male anxiety about strong women. Either way, Gunhild became a symbol of how Viking queens could terrify as much as they charmed. But glance past the throne and you see another side of the hall, concubines and captives. Not every woman here was wrapped in ermine and silver. Some were enslaved during raids, taken from distant lands, their futures rewritten overnight. For them, the hall's glory was a prison. They cooked, served, and sometimes warmed the beds of men who saw them as spoils of conquest. Quirky detail. Some of these women came from as far as the British Isles or even the Middle East, their exotic origins turning them into both status symbols and silent prisoners. Imagine the dissonance. One woman sips from a gilded cup, while another scrubs floors beside her, both trapped in the same hall but worlds apart. The sagas hint at complicated dynamics. A concubine might be scorned publicly, yet wield private influence over her master. A queen might resent her but also fear her sway. And occasionally, a concubine's child could inherit, sparking feuds over legitimacy. The hall was less Game of Thrones and more Game of Family feuds, with women caught at every level. And what about captives dragged back from raids? Some were forced into marriages, blurring the line between wife and slave. Others spent lifetimes in servitude, their voices lost entirely from the record. Historians still argue whether the sheer scale of this practice shaped Viking society more than the sagas admit. After all, raids weren't just about gold, they were about people. Viking households thrived on the labor of enslaved men and women, and that fact makes the gleaming longhouse suddenly darker. You sip mead from your imagination's cup and wonder, how did women reconcile these divides? Did queens see their power as fragile, knowing it rested on shifting alliances? Did captives dream of escape, whispering their old gods' names in the night? Did concubines plot, bargain, or simply survive? The answers are as smoky and elusive as the hall itself. Here's a quirky twist. In some sagas, powerful women are described as wielding not just words but magic. Queen Gunhild herself was accused of witchcraft, using sorcery to keep her grip on power. Was this true, or just medieval rumor-mongering against women who scared the establishment? You can almost hear the medieval cleric muttering, "If a woman is too clever, surely she's in league with demons." As the feast winds down, the contrast sharpens. On one side of the hall, a queen's laughter rings like silver bells. On the other, a captive girl curls up by the fire, clutching bread crusts, invisible to most. Both are Viking women, both part of the same society, both shaped by forces beyond their choosing. Feared, respected, or erased, their fates shift with the flick of a political wrist. You leave the hall with the noise still echoing in your ears. Tomorrow, you'll wander the bustling docks and trading ports, where women who aren't queens or captives carve out a different kind of space. Merchants wielding coin instead of keys, navigating freedom that always seems just one negotiation away. The hall's echoes fade as you step into crisp morning air, where gulls wheel overhead and the salt tang of the sea clings to everything. Before you now is a trading port, half mud, half magic. Wooden piers creak beneath crates of amber, piles of walrus ivory and barrels of tar, while longships bob against the tide, their dragon-headed prows snarling as though daring anyone to cheat their crew. At first glance, this seems like a man's world. Sailors unloading cargo, bearded traders shouting over prices, rough hands sorting coins. But look closer, and you spot women moving confidently through the throng. A matron with silver keys at her belt tallies goods on a wax tablet. A younger woman kneels to inspect a pelt, running her fingers through the fur before nomming a price. This is where the stereotype cracks. Viking women weren't always confined to hearth and hall. They could be merchants, negotiators, even shipowners. You trail one such figure, a widow who inherited her late husband's trading business. In Viking law, widows could manage property, and some stepped into roles that gave them unusual independence. She strides between stalls, her cloak edged in foreign silk, her eyes sharp as she bargains over a bolt of linen shipped from Frankish lands. And here's the mainstream historical fact. We know from archaeological finds, coins, scales, imported glassware, that women participated in long-distance trade, sometimes even running their own ventures. Imagine explaining that to someone who assumes medieval women only churned butter. Yet the irony isn't lost on you. While women here may count coins and strike bargains, the law still frames their power as conditional. A woman's ability to trade often hinged on being a widow or acting under a male guardian's permission. It's like society said, you can have freedom, but only on our terms. Historians still argue whether these legal openings reflected genuine empowerment or just a convenient way to keep commerce flowing when men were raiding abroad. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Viking women were buried with small folding scales, suggesting they carried their tools of trade with them, symbols of authority just as much as keys. It's a little like being buried with a calculator today, proof that numbers, not swords, could secure your legacy. You pass a dockside tavern where sailors brag about foreign journeys, but inside, you catch the soft murmur of women handling accounts. Someone has to balance the books while the warriors posture right. The contradiction is almost comical. The sagas glorify blood-soaked raids, yet without the quiet arithmetic of merchants, many of them female, the whole system would have collapsed like a poorly built ship. Still, shadows linger at the edges. Not every woman here is a free merchant. Some are enslaved, sold at the very docks where their captors unload furs and timber. Their labor fuels this bustling economy as much as trade routes do. You can almost hear the unspoken exchange. One woman haggles over silk, another is haggled over as property. Both are part of the market, though only one gets to walk away with silver in her purse. There's another layer of irony. Viking women merchants sometimes dealt directly with foreign traders who may have viewed them as curiosities. Imagine a Frankish monk arriving at a northern port, horrified yet fascinated to see a woman arguing over tariffs with sharper wit than any man. Perhaps he returned home muttering, "The North is upside down. Its women haggle like men." Historians still argue whether these encounters spread the fearsome reputation of Viking women abroad, adding to tales that painted them as wild, unruly, and dangerously independent. As the tide shifts, the widow you've been shadowing closes her ledger and glances toward the horizon. Ships depart for distant markets, Byzantium, Baghdad, even Greenland. Some of these voyages are financed with wealth she managed, her influence stretching farther than any hearth. And yet, she'll always be asked to justify that freedom. It's as though the Viking Age dangled opportunity in front of women, only to yank it back with a reminder: don't forget who writes the laws. The gulls cry louder, as if mocking the contradictions. Trade gives women the language of silver and scale weights, but never the full vocabulary of independence. You can't help but think of the sagas, where women are often remembered for sharp words rather than sharp bargains. Maybe that's the point. Their voices carried currency, but only so far before someone tried to clip them short. You leave the port behind with the sound of hammers repairing hulls, the smell of tar thick in your nose, and the vision of women straddling two worlds, freer than most in Europe, yet never entirely free. The next step of your journey pulls you toward their voices preserved in poetry and prose, songs and sagas where their reputations live on, sometimes celebrated, sometimes scorned. You hear the rustle of vellum and the hushed tones of an old storyteller as the port fades behind you. Now, you're not walking through docks or longhouses, you're slipping through pages. Viking women whisper here, not with silver scales or clanging keys, but with words etched into saga and song. If the marketplace gave them power in trade, the sagas gave them immortality, or at least the illusion of it. Take a step into the smoky hall of a skald, his voice weaving the verses of Laxdæla saga. There, women appear not as background scenery, but as sharp-tongued instigators, marriage brokers, and vengeance planners. You notice the common pattern. Women wield words like weapons, nudging men into action or shamming them into courage. One mainstream historical fact: in many sagas, women are portrayed as Gathar of domestic politics, pushing feuds forward when men hesitate. It's a reminder that, in a culture where reputation was everything, a single insult from a woman could slice deeper than a sword. And here, where the contradiction thickens, the sagas preserve their strength, but often in ways that reinforce gender boundaries. A woman who speaks boldly is both feared and admired, but she rarely gets to swing the blade herself. Historians still argue whether these literary portrayals reflected real social roles or whether the saga authors, often writing centuries later, were just dramatizing women into archetypes. It's a bit like Hollywood today, sometimes true, sometimes just. Convenient storytelling. Now lean closer for a quirky tidbit. Some Icelandic sagas describe women composing biting verses, called nith, to shame enemies. Imagine a medieval rap battle, except instead of losing street cred, you risked exile or worse. And yes, there are hints that some women were considered gifted poets. One famous figure, Jorun Skaldmar, earned her place as a female skald, composing praise poetry for kings. That's like sneaking into a boys-only band, and not just joining but out-soloing the lead guitarist. Still, even in song, women were often trapped by the same paradox: praised when clever, condemned when too bold. Take Gudrun Osvafurstatir, one of saga literature's most famous women. She manipulates marriages, stirs vengeance, and utters lines so cutting you can practically feel the sting centuries later. But notice how her story ends, with grief, solitude, and religious repentance. It's as if the narrative is saying, yes, she was powerful, but don't get any ideas. You wander deeper, past scenes of banquets and duels, and realize that these stories functioned as both memory and morality play. Viking men needed these fierce female voices in their tales, but society also needed to cage them inside tragedy. The sagas gave women stage time, yet often to remind listeners of the dangers of letting them step beyond their roles. Here's the irony, though. Outside the saga pages, Viking women kept weaving influence in quieter, more practical ways. The contrast between saga firebrands and archaeological reality is stark. The woman who nagged her husband into blood feud in a tale might, in real life, have been calculating how many cows to lend a neighbor or how to secure a daughter's dowry. Historians still argue whether the sagas exaggerated women's ferocity to entertain audiences, or reflected a grain of real fear men felt about female influence. You pause on one final image, a skald's words drifting through the rafters of a hall, women's laughter sharp in the background, their voices immortalized on parchment. They're both feared, as manipulators, witches of the tongue, and oppressed, their stories too often boxed into tropes. Yet in this echo, you sense defiance. Even if their authors wanted to limit them, Viking women slipped through the cracks, becoming unforgettable presences in cultural memory. As the saga's final line fades, the hall dissolves, leaving you with a strange thought. Sometimes being remembered, even imperfectly, is its own form of power. But memory can also be a cage, and the next part of your journey will show how female spirituality, prophecy, and the shadow of magic tested those bars. You step from the flickering saga hall into the glow of a mead hall, its timber walls reverberating with the bass hum of laughter, song, and clashing mugs. But amid the din of warriors boasting about raids, you notice a softer rhythm, the steady lull of a woman rocking a cradle. Viking motherhood was not a quiet corner of life. It was central, visible, and perilous. The firelight falls across her face, calm but weathered. You realize that in this world, her strength is measured not just by how many mouths she feeds, but by whether she can deliver the next generation of raiders, farmers, and storytellers. One mainstream historical fact: childbirth was one of the leading causes of death for Viking women, a stark reality in a society that depended on them for survival. Unlike the sword scars of warriors, their sacrifices left no heroic sagas, just the whispered lullabies of those who survived. Still, even this role carried a strange blend of power and oppression. Mothers could influence the fates of their children, sometimes arranging marriages or fostering alliances. Yet their authority was tied entirely to reproduction, an arena of status that was also a cage. You might think of it like being the CEO of one company that's vital to society, but only as long as the shareholders, men, decide it's profitable. And here's a quirky tidbit to mull over. Tiny shoes and amulets have been found in Viking graves, buried alongside infants who died before their first winters. Some archaeologists speculate that these talismans were not just tokens of love but magical protections, charms to guide a baby safely into the afterlife. It's as if the bond of motherhood didn't end with death but extended across worlds. One excavation in Burka revealed a woman buried with both a spindle whorl and a child's toy, blurring the line between domestic labor and maternal memory. Of course, sagas didn't always show mothers as gentle figures. Think back to Gudrun, whom you met earlier. Her grief for her children turned into vengeance, fueling feuds. Motherhood could be a source of ferocity. Historians still argue whether saga writers exaggerated this to highlight women as moral compasses, or as cautionary figures warning men of what happens when women's grief boils over. You move through the mead hall, past women cradling infants beside warriors polishing swords. There's an unspoken truth. While men measured themselves by raids and reputations abroad, women measured their legacy in the survival of children at home. Yet the two were entwined. Every warrior was once a bundle in a mother's arms, soothed by songs sung in the same smoky halls. The contradictions are stark. Women were revered as life-givers, yet their lives were often shortened by that very duty. They were honored in poetry as the bringers of kin, but rarely celebrated for themselves. And here's the tension you can't shake. In the same hall where men toasted victory, women quietly faced battles no sword could win. You pause at the cradle once more, the baby's breath soft against the backdrop of laughter. In that moment, you see the essence of Viking motherhood, not passive, not powerless, but burdened with an invisible weight heavier than any shield. They were feared for their grief-driven vengeance, yet oppressed by expectations that bound them to life and death cycles they could not escape. The mead hall slowly dims around you, and the cry of an infant fades into the low hum of a chant outside, a chant not of motherhood, but of magic. Soon, you'll walk into the shadows where women didn't just cradle life, but claimed the power to twist fate itself. The night air is sharp as you step beyond the warmth of the mead hall, into a world of whispers and fire-lit circles. Here, away from the feasting and the clamor of swords, you find yourself at the edge of something more ancient, more dangerous. A group gathers around a woman cloaked in animal skins, her staff topped with bronze rings that jangle softly in the wind. Her eyes catch yours, and you know instantly, you're in the presence of a Verlva, a seeress of the old ways. This is the realm of Seiner, the sorcery that Viking women were feared and revered for. It wasn't the kind of magic you imagine from a Disney film, no lightning bolts or cartoonish sparks. Instead, it was woven into trance, song, and ritual. The Verlva would chant herself into a vision, sometimes aided by hallucinogenic herbs, sometimes carried by the beat of drums. And what she saw could unsettle even the bravest warrior. Kings, in fact, would invite these women to their halls, desperate for a glimpse of what the future held before launching a raid or signing a treaty. But here, where it gets complicated, the practice of Seiner was considered unmanly. Men who dabbled in it were mocked or even outlawed, but women, well, society tolerated it barely. They were needed and feared in equal measure. Imagine being the emergency hotline everyone secretly relies on, but also the one they whisper about behind closed doors. A Viking man might swagger about his honor, but when his crops failed or his ship vanished at sea, he still sent for the Verlva. One mainstream fact: the famous saga of Eric the Red describes a seeress named Thorbjörg, wrapped in blue and carrying her staff, who was summoned during a famine to reveal when the hardship would end. She performed her chants, even led a group of women in a ritual song, and declared that better times were coming. Her words carried the weight of prophecy, shaping decisions for the entire community. Now for the quirky detail. Archaeological digs have uncovered Verlva graves containing staffs, strange iron rods, and even little pouches of hallucinogenic seeds, like a sorceress starter kit. One grave in Denmark revealed a wand-like staff tipped with a knob of iron, which some researchers jokingly compared to a Viking version of a Harry Potter prop. It's the kind of find that makes you imagine archaeologists dusting off the soil and quietly muttering, "Yep, this lady was not your average homemaker." But historians still argue whether Seiner was truly a sign of female empowerment or another form of marginalization. Were women respected because of this feared role or ostracized as dangerous outsiders? Some point to sagas where sorceresses are described in almost monstrous terms, their powers linked to chaos and deceit. Others see them as holding genuine authority, able to shape political decisions through prophecy. You can almost hear the scholars squabbling: priestess or pariah, visionary or villain. The truth probably lies, as always, in the uneasy middle. You stand in the flickering circle, watching as the Verlva sways, her chants low and rhythmic. Men keep their distance, pretending they don't need her, yet none of them dare laugh. You realize her position is paradoxical. She embodies both fear and necessity, oppression and agency. The seeress holds the threads of fate, but she also walks a knife's edge, tolerated only until her influence grows too great. As the ritual ends, the villagers murmur nervously, scattering back toward their homes. The Verlva's eyes linger on you a moment longer, as if she knows the path ahead. You leave the circle with a chill crawling up your spine, not from the cold, but from the knowledge that women here could command the unseen, yet were never free from suspicion. The wind carries the faint sound of church bells in the distance, and you know the next step of your journey will collide with a new faith. A faith that promises salvation, but not necessarily freedom. The clang of the blacksmith's hammer fades, and in its place comes a gentler sound. Bells, distant but insistent, carried on the wind like a summons. You follow the echo to a small wooden church rising where once there had been only a sacred grove of ash and oak. The carving on its door shows a crucified man, nailed and bleeding, so different from Odin hanging proud upon Yggdrasil. Christianity is here now, seeping into the cracks of the north, reshaping lives in ways both subtle and severe. For Viking women, the shift is complicated. On the surface, it looks like a blessing. Christian doctrine elevated marriage as sacred, frowned upon casual polygamy, and gave wives a stronger sense of legitimacy. A woman might breathe easier knowing her husband couldn't just abandon her for the next younger conquest without at least pretending to follow new rules. The church even spoke, at least in sermons, about protecting widows and orphans. That sounds comforting, right? Almost like a medieval insurance policy. But scratch the gold paint, and you see the iron beneath. With the Christian clergy came imported Roman and Frankish ideals of obedience and chastity, concepts that Viking society hadn't obsessed over in quite the same way. A woman who once might have confidently sung a bawdy verse in the mead hall was now expected to lower her eyes, cover her hair, and swallow her words. You'd think joining a faith promising eternal salvation would feel liberating, but in practice, the new rules often pressed heavier on women than men. Here's a firm historical fact. In Iceland, when Christianity was officially adopted around the year 1000, women suddenly lost the legal right to expose unwanted infants. Pre-Christian custom had allowed families to practice exposure, grim as it was, to control household size. Christianity condemned it as murder. On one hand, fewer infants left to the wolves is an obvious relief. On the other, it meant women's control over household reproduction shifted to the church and its moral gatekeepers, rather than remaining in their own hands. Now for the quirky detail. In some places, local women became the very first to carry the new faith into their households. Archaeologists in Norway have found small carved crucifixes buried with female skeletons, sometimes clasped in the palm like a talisman. It seems women often adopted the cross before their men did, perhaps finding comfort in prayers that replaced old ritual songs, or maybe using the new religion as a social lever. Historians still debate whether this was genuine piety or strategic adaptation. Picture a wife saying, "Honey, the priest says you can't beat me with that stick anymore," and her husband grumbling but thinking twice. Yet with every hymn sung in Latin came a new hierarchy. The church was a man's stage. Priests, bishops, abbots, nearly all male. Women could become nuns in certain contexts, yes, but in Scandinavia that option barely took root at first. Instead, most Viking women found their ritual roles: midwives, healers, seeresses, shrinking or shoved into the shadows. What had once been a Verlva chanting before a king now risked being labeled witchcraft, grounds for punishment. The sagas reflect the shift in subtle ways. Female characters who had once taken up power, commanding ships or trading across seas, begin to be portrayed with sharper criticism, their ambition recast as dangerous. The Christian scribes copying down these stories often flavored them with morality lessons, and those lessons rarely favored bold women. You walk through the dim wooden church, incense clinging to the air. A woman kneels, whispering prayers to Mary, her voice trembling with hope. She might find comfort here, maybe even solidarity, for Mary was a model of motherhood and endurance. But the whisper in your mind won't stop. Was this faith a ladder lifting women out of Viking constraints, or was it another set of chains disguised as silk cords? Historians still argue whether Christianity ultimately improved or worsened the lot of women in the north. When you step outside, the bells have stopped. Only the wind remains, rattling through the old pagan trees still rooted near the church. For women, the transition is never complete. Part old gods, part new hymns, part fear, part hope. You can't help but wonder how they balanced both worlds, knowing that whichever path they chose, the weight of control always seemed to fall heavier on their shoulders. The path bends now, leading you away from altars and sermons and into the stubborn question of land and legacy. Who owns what and who decides? That's the terrain waiting for you next. The path crunches under your boots as you wander away from the echo of church bells and back into the realm of soil, timber, and stone, the places where land and inheritance determined survival more than any sermon could. Here, Viking women's lives were written not only in sagas and prayers, but in deeds of ownership, boundary stones, and disputes shouted across a council field. You notice a woman standing at the edge of a farmstead, a ring of keys jangling at her waist, much like the ones you saw earlier. But these aren't just for doors and chests. They're symbols of ownership, rights tied to property, livestock, and even slaves. In certain regions, women could indeed inherit land, especially if there were no brothers to block their path. A widow, too, often controlled her late husband's farm until her sons came of age. That sounds surprisingly progressive for the 9th century, doesn't it? A woman standing before the law with her own rights to property. But here comes the catch. Those rights existed only within a carefully woven net of male authority. If a woman inherited, her male kin could still exercise guardianship over her decisions. And while a saga might show a determined woman dragging a neighbor to court, reality often meant compromises under pressure. Historians still argue whether these moments of female landholding represented genuine power or just a fragile exception. Let's drop in a firm fact. The Greg's law code of medieval Iceland specifically laid out inheritance patterns, and women could appear at the thing, the local assembly, to make their claims. That's ink on parchment, not just story. But in practice, those assemblies were overwhelmingly male spaces, filled with smoke, laughter, and intimidation. Picture trying to raise your voice there while everyone else thinks your opinion sounds more like background noise than argument. Now for a quirky tidbit. In some sagas, women are shown using their dowry land as leverage, almost like players in a medieval version of Monopoly. A shrewd wife might threaten to take her half back if her husband embarrassed her, which could be a pretty effective way to get him to sit down and hush at the mead table. It's a small glimpse of how clever negotiations might slip through the cracks of legal dominance. Yet even these instances reveal the thin illusion of choice. A woman might technically hold land, but she could be pressured into remarriage so her new husband would manage it. Or worse, she might find herself surrounded by male cousins or brothers eyeing her property like wolves around a lamb. What looked like empowerment was often a waiting game, one that ended with her signature absorbed into someone else's authority. Imagine this. You stand at a windswept boundary marker, a stone carved with runes that declare ownership. A woman's name is etched there. For a moment, it feels radical, as if she carved her independence into the earth itself. But you can't shake the sense that behind that name are layers of negotiation, compromise, and male approval. There's another open debate here too. Some historians suggest Viking women's rights to property were relatively stronger than those of Christian women elsewhere in Europe at the time. Others argue that's a romanticized reading of selective evidence. Were Viking women truly exceptional in this regard, or are we just dazzled by the rare examples? The jury is still out, and maybe always will be. So you walk on, watching as the woman at the farmstead disappears into her hall, her keys rattling like a warning and a promise. She may control the grain stores for now, may even bring her case to the assembly, but you can't forget the looming shadow. Male kin circling, laws tightening, the illusion of freedom always a heartbeat away from vanishing. Ahead, a different sound grows louder, gossip carried across borders, stories embroidered by monks and traders who had never seen the North with their own eyes. Viking women weren't just farmers' wives or landholders. They became monsters and marvels in the minds of outsiders. That is where your path takes you next. You step onto a muddy road that leads not north but outward, toward the eyes and pens of outsiders. Here, Viking women become less like flesh and blood neighbors and more like shadowy figures whispered about in markets and monasteries. You don't just hear about them, you hear about how others imagined them. And those reputations, equal parts admiration and dread. Picture a monk in Francia, scribbling by candlelight. His quill scratches complaints about raiders, and tucked into his words are strange descriptions of the women who travel with them. Some chronicles hint that Viking women were as terrifying as the men, painting them as bloodthirsty, unholy, or even worse, seductive temptresses pulling Christian souls away from salvation. You almost want to roll your eyes. It's the same tired trope that pops up in history over and over. Blame the women when things get messy. Still, some accounts also carry a kind of astonished respect. Foreigners noticed that women in the North wore finely wrought brooches, elaborate bead necklaces, and even wielded visible authority within their households. To cultures where women were tucked firmly into the background, that could look wild, even dangerous. Historians still argue whether these impressions were accurate reflections of Norse society or just exotic exaggerations designed to thrill and scare European readers. Here's a mainstream fact for you. Arab traveler Ahmed ibn Fadlan encountered Norse traders along the Volga in the 10th century and recorded, in great detail, the funeral of a chieftain. His description of a female slave sacrificed to accompany her master is both grisly and invaluable. It shows how outsiders witnessed women's roles at the extremes, either as honored priestesses presiding over rituals or as victims caught in brutal tradition. Neither view leaves much room for ordinary life, but both reveal the charged reputation Viking women carried. Now for something quirky. In a few later medieval European texts, Viking women were imagined almost like valkyries, riding out of the north to enchant or destroy. One chronicler even suggested they wore trousers, a shocking detail to medieval readers who associated pants with men alone. Imagine the scandal in a cloister when someone whispered, "They wear breeches." Truly, fashion as reputation-ruining scandal isn't new at all. The tricky part is separating fact from projection. Were Viking women genuinely feared across Europe, or were they just folded into the broader terror of Norse raiders? A ship arriving on the Thames, sails snapping, axes glinting, that was frightening enough. Add in rumors that even the women were fierce, and suddenly the North looked like a land of monsters where no gender played safe. You wander through a trading port in England, listening as locals mutter. Some warn of northern women who cast spells and hexes. Others claim they drink as heartily as the men and laugh at Christian modesty. You can almost hear the mix of envy and horror in their voices. To them, Viking women are both a warning and a fantasy. Too free, too strange, too unlike the proper role models they wanted their daughters to follow. And yet reputation cuts both ways. A Viking woman married off to a foreign noble could carry prestige. Her very strangeness made her valuable in courts hungry for alliances. Imagine the whispered introductions. "She's from the north, you know those people." Her presence both elevated and unsettled the halls she entered. The irony, of course, is that the women themselves rarely controlled these reputations. They were mythologized in ways they couldn't predict. One century, they're witches. Another, they're noble brides. In modern times, pop culture paints them as horn-helmeted warriors who never actually existed. Reputation has a way of blurring flesh into legend. As the road curves, you realize this is where the Viking woman becomes less a neighbor in a farmstead and more an echo in European imagination. At once feared and admired, oppressed and elevated, human and myth. But soon, the sagas themselves will fade. The settlements will shrink and the great age of raiding will end. What remains are memories and echoes, carried into the present. That's where your path is heading next. The air shifts now softer, like a lantern dimming at the close of a long feast. You find yourself at the twilight of the Viking Age, when longships rest idle in coves, and the world begins to fold those fierce northern women into memory. The sagas are still sung, yes, but the voices are fewer, the mead halls quieter, and the sharp edge of their reputations blunted by time and politics. Christianity has swept deeper through the North, reshaping daily life. Women once called upon as priestesses now find themselves nudged into church pews. The magic of Seiner is rebranded as dangerous witchcraft, a thing whispered about and punished rather than sought. And yet, echoes of power remain. Women still hold the keys at their waists, they still oversee farms when men go to sea, and they still inherit land in some places. It's just that the light on their authority grows dimmer, the boundaries closing in as medieval Europe's stricter codes of gender roll over Scandinavia. Mainstream fact here. By the 12th century, Icelandic law codified many of the old practices into stricter forms, reducing women's freedoms compared to earlier centuries. What had once been flexible, divorce rights, land ownership, priestess roles, became more restricted as Christian norms pressed in. You can almost see a woman standing on an Icelandic homestead, staring out at the mountains, realizing her daughters will have fewer choices than she did. But history doesn't tie itself up neatly. There's always the quirky thread. In some later sagas, Viking women appear as larger-than-life figures who control entire households, or even challenge men to duels when insulted. The line between history and storytelling blurs here, but it hints at how deeply the memory of their fierceness stuck, even when society itself was shrinking their space. And here's the debate historians still circle around. Were Viking women truly more free than their European counterparts, or do we just romanticize the exceptions? Some argue their rights to divorce, property, and authority were remarkable for the era. Others insist those freedoms were still sharply limited, and that tales of warrior women or powerful queens are distractions from the ordinary grind of labor, childbirth, and quiet subservience. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere tangled in between. You keep walking, following their echoes into modern times. Today, Viking women are icons, carved in stone on TV screens, dressed in leather and wielding axes in video games, their braids immaculate, their eyeliner suspiciously modern. We celebrate them as warriors and leaders, even as the real women lived far messier, harder lives. But maybe that's the legacy. They remain contradictory, always larger than the categories assigned to them. Feared and oppressed, remembered and forgotten, made into myths long before their ships stopped sailing. As the night deepens, you hear their whispers fade like waves against a fjord. They were never just victims, never simply heroines. They carried keys and swords, prayers and spells, laughter and grief. And whether in sagas or in modern imagination, Viking women linger, complicated, haunting, and unforgettable. Now the pace slows, like the last candle melting on a stone windowsill. You've wandered far, from smoky hearths in frozen fjords to the gilded halls of kings, from sagas sung in flickering firelight to the quieter pages of European chronicles. Viking women have shifted before your eyes, sometimes feared, sometimes dismissed, sometimes celebrated, and always caught in contradictions. Let the images settle, the ring of keys at a waist, the shimmer of beads across a tunic, the sudden laughter in a mead hall, the whisper of spells cast under moonlight. Let them blur together, softer now, not demanding attention but easing into memory. These women lived under weighty laws and constant risks, yet they carved moments of strength into a world that did not always welcome it. As you lie here, you might think of them less as distant figures and more as presences who remind you of resilience, of persistence even when power is limited. Their reputations, exaggerated or real, survive because they carried something undeniably strong within them. So breathe slower. Let the cold northern wind in your mind quiet to a breeze. Imagine the sea finally calm after a storm, the ship rocking gently at anchor, stars stretching endlessly overhead. The women of the north are no longer marching, no longer struggling. They are simply resting, their voices fading into the hush of time. And you too can rest now. Your journey tonight is complete. The sagas close, the lights dim, and you are safe, carried by the rhythm of history into sleep. Sweet dreams. Sweet dreams.